Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I feel like I haven't done a lunch and learn in a long time. We've been doing them. I just haven't gotten to do one in a while. We got through all of the, what is this artifact? And so I sort of disappeared for a while, but I'm back. Ready to bring you kind of a part 2 discussion. I think it was about this time previously, I gave a little talk about women in archaeology that turned out, when I ended up crafting it together, talking more about how women archaeologists have changed our understanding of the past. And often with these talks, what I do is I get an idea of something I want to spend some time thinking about and researching more, and then try to craft a talk around it, rather than something that I had sort of just sitting in the bag. But and that's what this one did. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Furlong-Minkoff. I'm the Assistant Director of Archaeology and the Curator of Archaeological Collections here at Montpelier. Been here about 6 years. One of my favorite things to do is take our archaeological record, particularly the artifacts in it, and try to think of what are new questions I can ask out of those things. And part of the reason that's one of my favorite things to do is because we have over 3 million artifacts in our collection. And each one has a story to tell. And it's so often that we're so focused on pulling them out of the ground, we forget to kind of go back and look at those things. So we're going to do a little bit of that today, but we're also going to talk about some new sites. So I'm going to share my screen so you all can see my presentation and see some pretty things that are came out of the ground rather than me. And then we're going to have a lot of time, I think, for some questions and some discussions. So let's get it to it. Let's see. All right. What are you all seeing? Are you seeing, looking for enslaved women in the sites of labor?
Yeah, we can see that, Mary.
Yeah.
Perfect. Sometimes when I have 2 screens going on, I'm not exactly sure what everybody's seeing. So the idea for this talk came, Matt and I were sort of thinking about what new lunch and learns we could talk about, and we knew March was Women's History Month. So one of the things I really wanted to think about is, having worked at the home farm, having worked at these sites of labor, is how people think about these spaces and think about the enslaved people that are in these spaces. In particular, you know, are we thinking, when we think of fields and blacksmith shops and barns, are we imagining in our heads men? Are we imagining in our head women? Are we imagining children? And how can we sort of see evidence of that? So I love this quote. And if any of you all love reality television or British television, you might watch the Great British Bake Off or the British Baking Show. But one of the hosts, Sandy, has this very famous quote, and you'll see it circulate around on social media, where she says, "When I was a student at Cambridge, I remembered an anthropology professor holding up a picture of a bone with 28 incisions carved in it. This is often considered to be man's first attempt at a calendar," she explained. She paused as we dutifully wrote this down. "My question to you is this: what would a man need to mark 28 days? I would suggest to you that this is woman's first attempt at a calendar. It was in that moment that changed my life. In that second, I stopped to question almost everything I had been taught about the past and how often I had overlooked women's contributions." And it makes for a great, meme to put on social media. But I think the point is really powerful, is that so often when we think about the past, we sort of default to thinking about men in the past. And I think part of that is because how many of us learn history and who we're taught about in history. I think it's also, we kind of take our biases of what we understand certain jobs or certain duties to be, or responsibilities, and we reflect them back on people in the past. But I think it's just a really important thing to kind of hold on to, is how do we look at this a little differently? How do we look at the past differently? How do we ask different questions? And I think it's a really important reminder that it matters who's asking the questions, because each of us ask different questions, maybe because of our gender, or maybe because of our sexuality or our race or our ability, or even where we're from. All allows us to look at things a little differently and ask different questions. So that's always kind of a fun thing to think about. And also, it's lunchtime, so anytime you can talk about baked goods is good. So how do we look at the past differently? One way to look at the past differently is really to think about intersectionality. So this talk today is really talking about women, but it's impossible to talk about people as just one thing, as just their biological sex or their gender or even their race or status. So this is kind of again, a meme or a graph that you'll see a lot, explaining intersectionality, how all these different components of our being make up who we are and affect our understanding and how we move through the present, but also our understanding of the past. But I think one of the things, particularly when we're talking about enslaved people, is that their status as being enslaved affects how they move through the past, how we understand them, how people wrote about them, the information that gets passed down about them. But enslaved people are so often written about. I was doing some research to prepare for this talk, and so often the thing I would be reading would just say 40 slaves or 40 enslaved people, and would not talk about women or children or men or elderly or, right-handed people or left-handed people or, artists or musicians. Enslaved people are so often not only written about in the past, but how they're written about in the present by historians, by archaeologists, by people writing about them as just this sort of monolithic group without all these individual things that make their experiences unique and make them unique individuals. And so that was one of the things I was really kind of struggling with as I was putting this together. So what do we know about enslaved women at Montpelier from the historical record? We know of a lot of enslaved women at Montpelier, and here are two examples of resources we have. One is a shoe size list from 1787 that was written out by James Madison Sr., where he lists the names of enslaved people and the size shoe that they would wear. From this list, we actually know a lot of names of enslaved people that would have been here in 1787, but that's all we know about them: their name, their shoe size. So we really don't know about their skills, their jobs, their family relationships. Connecting to some other documents, we can start to tease that out. And I saw Hillary was on this. So if you have great questions about the documents, I'm sure at the end of this, Hillary can help with a lot of that information, the work she's done to connect these sort of very brief references to other very brief references to see if you can flesh out a bigger picture. One of the other documents here is a note from John Payne Todd's journal from 1845. So John Payne Todd was Dolly Madison's son. And this is after the selling of the Montpelier property, where Payne Todd is trying, we think, making lists of enslaved people to try to figure out who he needs to sell to pay off debts, how he can get the amount of money out of them. And so sometimes there are references to individuals. You can see on here, kind of just above the red circle is Abraham, but above that is Harriet. But then you see Gabriel's daughter. And I think this is really interesting. So often what we know about women is perhaps the mother's name and then her connection to her children. But in this example, we don't know the woman's name. We only know her connection to her father. So kind of an example that's a little different than what we typically see. But again, just sort of a fleeting example, a little bit of a connection to family, but not a lot else. And so one of the things I found when I was looking through the documentary record was what I could actually find about enslaved women that we have in our documentary record was pretty small. Maybe names, maybe some family relationships. For understanding maybe some of the work that they did or skills that they had. Primarily the references seem to be to women who were enslaved in domestic work around the main house. Folks like Suki, or who's working as Dolly's enslaved maid, some of the enslaved cooks, folks like that who are working around the main house. But really the women who are working in the fields, who are working outside of the main house, don't seem to be showing up in the documentary record that is recorded by the Madisons. So it really made it hard to place names to the women that would have been in the area, spending the majority of the time in the areas that we've been looking at in the past year. So what do we know about enslaved women at Montpelier from the archaeological record? In the same way, a lot of our artifacts that we feel comfortable tying to enslaved women in particular are from areas closer to the main house, from the areas particularly around the South Yard, so the quarters that are closest to the main house. And a lot of that is because those artifacts often reflect jobs or skills or crafts we associate with women. So what you can see here is a pair of sewing scissors and then a hand-carved bone bobbin for lace making. So these are jobs, sewing, making lace, that sort of work with textiles and fabrics is something we generally associate with women. So through that kind of artifacts related to work, we can start to see the presence of women. The other thing we can look at are artifacts related to dress. Again, these are artifacts primarily coming out from closer to the main house. On the left, you see a finger ring that is a copper alloy with a little paste gem glass stone in it, and a hand-carved bone parasol topper. So we do know both from the documents and because we find parasol parts that parasols were something that enslaved women had and used. So I think one of the other things that we often look at these artifacts and think immediately of children. On the left, you see a child-sized thimble, in the center, a porcelain doll leg, and on the right, a hand-carved little limestone marble. But I really kind of wanted to flip this on the head and think about these as artifacts related to motherhood. So how do you get children? You get children from mothers. And particularly the thimble, having that small thimble, an enslaved child learning how to sew, most likely, again, learning from her mother. So seeing this presence of children really suggests the presence of women because that's how the children got there. So how do we see enslaved women at sites of labor? It seems really easy to kind of see women in these domestic sites, and particularly these sites around the main house, but let's talk a little bit about the home farm. So for those of you who have worked on the home farm or have listened to our presentations or have been here, you know that the home farm is the farm of our plantation that is closest to the main house. So for those of you who haven't been here, the main house is just sort of off this picture, kind of going off the top right corner of this page, if you will. The visitor center, and then the areas where we've recently been working in the past couple years. So the overseer site, the blacksmith shop, the recently discovered burn site that we think is a tobacco barn, and of course what we originally called the farrier site or farrier shop that we think might be a more encompassing blacksmith spot. There are some other sites that we had previously found. The area that's marked as homes for enslaved families, those you might hear us refer to them as the field quarters. So those are quarters that would have housed enslaved people. You know, we were talking about this, Matt and Chris and Terry and I were chatting about this a little bit yesterday. And I think, you know, talking about this term, the field quarters, sort of assigning that term, thinking, well, the people that worked in the fields lived here. But I think we need to think about it more as these are the quarters that are closest to the fields. Another site that we are going to be looking at this coming year is where it says that farm stable sort of down in that area. Just kind of up to the right near the visitor center. We're also going to be looking at another domestic site. And then, of course, we have in the middle there where it says threshing barn, the barn that started its life as a tobacco barn and ended its life as a wheat threshing barn, while also in between being used as temporary housing for enslaved people. So you have all these sites, and it seems very easy to kind of break them into these really neat and tidy groups of these are places where people lived, these are places where people worked. And sometimes we, in our brains, kind of break that on gender lines or divisions between women and men. And what I'm really going to encourage us all to do today is kind of think beyond that. So just like taking the homes for the enslaved families that we have thought for so long of as the field quarters, and kind of losing that idea that just because you lived in that house that you worked in the fields, or the reverse of that is just because you lived in the South Yard meant that you worked in the main house. What I think we're starting to find is it's a whole lot blurrier than that, which makes sense that it's blurrier than that, because on Montpelier's property, over the occupation of both the Madisons and following the Madisons, while we have 3 generations of Madisons on the property, we end up having 6 generations of the enslaved community on the property. At any one time, 80 to 100 enslaved people are on the property during the Madison's lifetime. And they're related and they're friends and they're moving from place to place. They're getting married. They're having, they have siblings and brothers and cousins. And they're not necessarily only engaging with or marrying or having relationships or having family members that do the exact same jobs as them. So really kind of thinking about that this all isn't as neat and tidy as I think we like it to be or initially try to wrap our heads around. So how do we see women at sites of labor? One thing we can do is rethink the artifacts that we've already found. So these are 2 artifacts that were recovered from those excavations about 10 years ago or more in those quarters that we call the field quarters. One is on the left here is a slate pencil. So we think about writing slates. This is an amazing artifact that, represents the learning of literacy, learning to read and write. Not something you would use to keep a permanent record, but really to teach and to practice. And really thinking about the role of enslaved women as those teachers, as those educators for their children. If you come to Montpelier and you go on one of our regular highlights tours, one of the things that our guides will talk to you about often is how James Madison's mother and grandmother and their roles as educating the future president and their children, that the earliest years of education for the Madisons came from their mothers. And now taking that exact model and thinking about, well, that's true for the enslaved community as well, that the mothers taking these roles of education. And particularly for sites like what we found, like the blacksmith shop, this becomes incredibly important. We know in the 18th century blacksmith shop, the one that was up by the temple, that Moses, who was the main enslaved blacksmith, was literate, not only in letters, but in numbers. He was basically keeping the books for Madison Sr. And in the documents, it infers that the other enslaved blacksmiths are able to do that work as well. So this knowledge, this literacy, this effect of women on their children becomes incredibly powerful. When we bring people to the blacksmith shop today, we often talk about, the blacksmith, the male blacksmith training a male relative or son, maybe apprenticing them to learn the skills of blacksmithing. But what we often don't talk about is the importance of literacy in both letters and numbers, and who would have been training the child in that. And I think this is a way where we can start to see the role of women, and particularly mothers, in the home farm. One of the other things is this piece to the right, this big hoe fragment. And I think this is really interesting. So often when we think about the labor done by enslaved people, particularly if it's something physical, like working in the fields, we automatically assume it was done by men. But one of the things we so often find, both through the documents, through all sorts of research, is that it was actually women doing a big bulk of this work. So this hoe was probably most likely used by a woman in the tobacco fields or in the other work. And in particular, hoeing was a job most often associated with enslaved women. So I wanted to show you this because I thought it was really interesting. On the right, you have images from the burn site where we identified the tobacco barn, and you can see sort of the depressions both in profile as well as in that overhead shot. But this image to the left, I found where I was looking for some images to use in this presentation. And I found a lesson plan that had been created by the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation a couple of years ago about tobacco farming and cultivation in Virginia. And this is the image that they chose to use, which I think is really interesting. It's a white woman sorting through and checking tobacco before it gets put into a hogshead-sized barrel. And I think this is what so often ends up happening. We go on these experiences, whether it's going to Williamsburg and visiting the blacksmith shop or these other historic sites. And so often how they're being interpreted, even particularly costume interpreted, is by white people. But in the reality, this is work that would have been done by enslaved Africans and enslaved African Americans. So I wanted to show you this, because this is a painting from 1798, I believe, by Latrobe, showing who's actually doing this work. And you can see a white overseer and enslaved African or African-American women using a hoe, just like the one that we found during our previous excavations to do this work. So taking this image of the period and rethinking how we kind of see modern day images of the past, of what that, who should actually be checking the tobacco before it goes into the barrel, who is doing that work, not only of the cultivation, but of the processing. And so I think it's a really important thing as we think back of those images that sort of set in our brain and kind of question, well, where do they come from? Do they come from history? Do they come from archaeology? Or do they come from sort of a modern interpretation of the past that's not really connected to what it really looked like on the ground? So blacksmithing and ironwork. So how do we see women at sites of labor? Blacksmithing, so these are some images of artifacts from the blacksmith site that we worked on this past year. On the right, you see kind of the tip of a blacksmithing tong. On the left, these are all used and clipped horseshoe nails that were all recovered from the blacksmith shop. And so when we talk about the blacksmith shop and we talk about the work of blacksmithing of a smith, so often we talk specifically about the ironwork, the metalwork itself. And we really know from the historic documents, not only at Montpelier, but kind of throughout the region, that most of that smith kind of work was being done by men. But women are playing a key role in supporting that work, not only on plantations, but at ironworks, at really large iron mines, iron works, in the smithing and smelting and process. So at Catoctin in Maryland, at the Baltimore Iron Works, and even at the iron works in Virginia, we are seeing women, enslaved women, being part of the labor force at these sites. So I was doing a little look into, for example, the Baltimore Iron Works, when Dr. Carroll is setting up the ironworks in the 1700s, he is kind of doing out math and figuring out, okay, I need to buy 2 enslaved men to be smiths and 2 enslaved men to be miners and this and this. And he's doing out the math and, figuring out about a dozen or so enslaved people he needs to purchase. And 2 of them he's identifying as women. And so this work of enslaved women at those large sites was often to cook or do domestic work to support the men, but it was also to do things like make charcoal, rake charcoal, do kind of, I would say, I'm going to go back, boom, less skilled labor than what the smith is actually doing, but is often very manual labor. And so when Matt and I happened to be chatting the other day, and he was talking about how in Jamaica, Often it was the enslaved women doing the really difficult manual labor and the enslaved men that were doing the highly skilled work on the plantations in Jamaica. And you see that as well happening at these ironworks in the mid-Atlantic. And I would venture to say that's also what's happening here on this plantation, where you have enslaved men doing the smithing work, but you have enslaved women getting the charcoal ready, doing the processing, doing all of this kind of support labor to allow that smithing to happen. So this, you can see, for example, this is a bunch of the charred wood that has come out of the blacksmith shop. So maybe it's looking at artifacts like these that is really where we can start to see enslaved women. So how else do we say enslaved women at sites of labor? And I would venture to say through unexpected artifacts. So these are all artifacts that you'll see here from this site that we originally called the Farrier site. If you look on the right, all of those artifacts right there, you can see giant piles of iron as well as slag that all came out of one unit. And there you can see sort of the repetition. These artifacts in the center, the three little kind of copper items that are sort of green on top of the little pewter object that's kind of a whitish silver, came out of this unit that you see all the artifacts spread across the table in the field. So unexpected artifacts, I think if you go into a site thinking it's going to be a farrier shop, you expect to find horse-related things, horseshoe nails, horseshoes, maybe some smithing tools or some shoeing tools to do that work. What you're not expecting to find is brass, is copper, are nails like what you see on the left, which is a building nail rather than a horseshoe nail, or ceramics like what you see on the bottom, a little bit of transferware on the left, a little bit of hand-painted refined earthenware on the right. You're not necessarily expecting to see all those things. So the unexpected, I think, is often where we're going to see the women. So doing, again, that some kind of support work, making the meals, providing food for the men that are doing kind of the farrier work or the blacksmithing work. Also making us rethink a site. We expected to find all of these things just to say it was a farrier site. We found a bunch of stuff that suggested more types of work was going on there, including working maybe with some other metals. So how do women fit into that? How do they fit into that diversity of labor, the support of that, and the kind of division of tasks in order to make all of that happen? So I think another way we see enslaved women is when we see evidence of people moving through spaces. Like I said in the beginning, we get in these traps, I think, really easily of saying, you know, all of the enslaved domestic people lived in the South Yard, worked in the main house, and kind of get it in our brain that they never left that area. When if you come to visit Montpelier, you walk all over the property. When I am at Montpelier, like I am right now at work, I walk all over the property. I'm constantly moving through these spaces. I think one of the other things we found recently is how enslaved people were moving through the spaces is quite a bit different than how we move through the spaces today. So this photograph you see on the right of Chris kind of talking to this whole group is taken from, we're standing kind of at the lower part of the blacksmith shop, having just walked across a historic road area connecting from the farrier shop, going behind where you can see those reconstructed log cabins are, where we found homes for the enslaved community, to the blacksmith shop. And that road doesn't exist today. It's a big open field. And instead, when you come to the property, there's a road just kind of behind Chris, which is the one that everybody walks up and down to connect these spaces. And when you flip it and you move through that way people moved in the past, all of a sudden you're having a very different experience. So even these spaces that we might identify as being primarily male, or that the people that are working in them are primarily men, women are still showing up. So whether maybe it is an enslaved woman bringing that lunch to her husband, her partner, her son, her brother, her cousin, her friend, and that's how the ceramics end up there. Or maybe they're coming to a visit, maybe they're doing something else. And so a couple artifacts that I think really highlight this movement are the ones found on the left. The circle is part of a wagon wheel, and then the horseshoe. Those artifacts, you would think, oh, those must be from the farrier shop or the blacksmith shop. Those are actually both from the burn site, this tobacco barn. So finding this evidence of people moving through this space, getting connected. The other one, that piece of ceramic you see is a fragment of bamboo and peony, which we know is the Madison's everyday dishes. It's a transfer print from England made by the Davenport Company in the 18 teens and 1820s. It is what they call an English stone china, so it's a high quality object. And we found that out at the blacksmith shop, all the way out at the blacksmith shop. So thinking about how does that get there? It has to get there. There's no way a plow or a natural force could carry it that far. It had to be brought by a human. So who is that human, and how does this movement really highlight, I think, the presence of women? So perhaps an enslaved woman coming from the main house down to visit the blacksmith shop. And when I was looking at sort of comparisons for this, I was reading and watching a little video from Monticello, from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, which is, just down the road from us. And it was on a piece about one of the enslaved blacksmiths there who had not officially run away, but had left the property. And Jefferson's sort of all taken aback that he has left. But what turns out, this enslaved blacksmith has actually traveled from Monticello to the White House to visit his wife, because Jefferson has taken his wife with him to Washington, D.C. to work as an enslaved domestic woman. And so he basically runs away to visit his wife. So that shows that dynamic of, just because you are a craftsman doesn't mean you only associated with craftsmen. Just because you are an enslaved domestic doesn't mean you only associate with other enslaved domestics or working in the field. That women and men are moving through these spaces. And to understand these spaces, it's really important that we recognize kind of the blurriness, the gray areas, the movement of all of this, and that no space is and no artifact is distinctly male or distinctly female. They're all things that are used by people. So what does this mean? There's a whole lot of, okay, what does this mean? It means a couple of things. It means we have a whole lot more research to do. One of the ways we're going to be able to get at more of this is we have to finish our analysis of the home farm, of the work that we've already done. So we haven't gotten everything completely cataloged yet, but we are working on it at a pretty good clip. So we should have that all done in the next couple months. The other thing we need to do is re-examine the work that we've already done. So question ourselves, why are we calling buildings certain things? Why have we looked at certain artifacts in ways before? So like that slate pencil, like that hoe, that maybe we just discussed as, oh, this was used by an enslaved person. Well, who is that enslaved person? And really asking ourselves to paint a picture of who that individual was. And part of that picture is figuring out their gender if we can. And then the next thing is to look at more sites in the home farm. So in 2022, we're in March now. We're about to start our field season again. And one of the sites we're going to go to is another, what we believe is another home for enslaved people in the home farm. It's closer up to the visitor center, so not down by where those reconstructed cabins are. And what you can see the picture on the right and in the center are all artifacts that came out of the ground maybe a week or two ago during the metal detecting survey of that area. So already we're seeing things that look very different than what was coming out of the ground at any of the sites we looked at last year. You see a glass bottle base next to a green shell-edged ceramic. You see some nails, but also that little buckle in the center, I think, is actually a buckle, like a breeches buckle, so a knee buckle for pants for a men's pair of breeches or pants. So already starting to see kind of a more variety or diversity of artifacts, but holding in us of how do we look at them differently? How do we connect them more? And then again, you see another picture there from the tour, again, where we're walking along sort of these historic road traces. So how do we move through the landscape differently? And how do we encourage ourselves to get comfortable pushing beyond just sort of these references of, 40 enslaved people or 10 enslaved person or this enslaved person or that enslaved person, and really kind of go, well, who was that person? What did they look like? How old were they? Were they a man? Were they a woman? Were they an adult? Were they a child? What picture, using the artifacts, using the documentary record, using oral history, what picture of these individuals can we paint? And I think what we can do is actually learn a whole lot more about people in the past when we look at them and we start asking us these questions and push ourselves to kind of go beyond just the basics. So that's kind of my thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for right now and just see if anybody has any questions or thoughts or curiosities about what we were talking about today. Or did it all make perfect sense? Awesome. All right, well, if nobody has, oh, somebody raised a hand. Whoever raised their hand, you can unmute yourself. Carolyn.
This is Carolyn from Pennsylvania. I think it's fascinating, but also enlightening. I have really been trying very hard to educate myself and people around me to use the words enslaved rather than slave, because it changes our whole pattern of thinking in terms of people first, who were enslaved, and the fact that women have not been recognized as doing a considerable amount of the labor. I thank you very much for bringing this to light. And oh, I itch to get back there. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and come back soon. I think that, we all have sort of biases in our head of, maybe it's even how we grow up, where maybe someone's dad said, the sons mow the lawn and the daughters do the dishes or whatever, and kind of not taking our own personal experience and necessarily projecting it on the past. One of the things that I found quite a bit was looking at some of the references talking about West African cultures and divisions of labor around ironworking, but also around cultivation in West African culture, and the work that women did in Africa versus what they were expected to once they were kidnapped and brought to the Mid-Atlantic, and how that shifted. And how sometimes it replicated. So sometimes it was, again, that kind of support labor for the men doing ironwork, but really the role of women in cultivation in West Africa, and how often enslaved men were asked to take on those tasks once they came to the Mid-Atlantic, and that was really kind of, an extra punch to the gut, because it went around against sort of cultural ideas of what jobs and duties were for men from certain cultures in West Africa. So I think it's really interesting, because not only do we have kind of our modern perspective, we can know a lot about English ideas of gender roles, or white American ideas of gender roles in the 1700s and the 1800s. But then when you take in the factor of what are the pre-existing ideas that enslaved Africans had coming out of their own cultures, and I say cultures because there's lots of different cultures and languages and practices in West Africa where people are being pulled from, and kind of reinventing this in this new model, I think is really complicated. So Pat, go ahead.
Hi, I live in Prince William County, and when you were talking about going to the Baltimore Ironworks, I was wondering if you looked at the Neabsco Ironworks, because that was huge. That was a Talo Ironworks.
I didn't look at that one. I looked at Buffalo Forge in Virginia, or the data that came out of Buffalo Forge and some of the work that folks are doing to understand the role of women at Buffalo Forge and of enslaved women. There's I think a PhD student at William and Mary, maybe, that was looking at that. And then I looked particularly at Baltimore because there was an archaeologist that had done an analysis there. So I kind of just went off sites that I knew or had connections to the research for.
We don't have a strong archaeology program in Prince William County, but I know that there has been a lot of work done, and there's a lot of documentary documents, records that you might find interesting. On a personal note, I have to add that when you were talking about people taking food to the various, like to the farrier's shop, and I was reminded of a photograph I have from the early 1900s, and it's coal trucks. My grandparents lived in Western Pennsylvania, and it's coal trucks, and my grandmother is carrying lunch to her father, and it's a comical picture because she has on all white. But that made perfect sense that the women would be going to those places and taking lunch or taking food or whatever as well. And you had that small piece of I think it was Chinese export porcelain, but it didn't have a size on it. I wondered if somebody's shoe picked it up and took it to that site.
The tiny little piece of the transfer print.
Yeah, maybe. It was blue and white.
Yeah, I think it would have been. It's probably about maybe an inch. I think it would have been a little hard to just carry via shoe.
Okay.
The amount of distance that it would have had to have gone.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
All
right, we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So Betty asked specifically about the carnelian ring. So Betty, you asked for it, so I'll talk about it. And you can also correct me if I say anything wrong. I am going to real quick, because I think this is going to be the easiest way to show it, change my background. So you can see in my virtual background, this is a different ring than the one I showed in my presentation. This one is made of a stone called carnelian, and we believe this is the only artifact in our collection to have come from Africa. So like I mentioned before, we have about 3 million archaeological artifacts in our collection, and this is the only one that we feel like we can trace to Africa. So this ring itself, kind of the origins of this ring, we discovered it in 2016 when we were doing the excavations of a site that is in the South Yard. The building that we were excavating started its life as we think a architecturally what's called a planter's cottage. So it's a building with a solid brick wall, and the rest is a timber frame structure. We think it was built kind of as a starter home for James Madison Sr. and Nellie Madison, so the president's parents. Sometimes you'll hear it be referred to as Madison's boyhood home, but we think that that's what it started. So kind of always intended to be a temporary home, while construction on the main Montpelier was always being planned and done. Moved into the main Montpelier, the main house, we think maybe used as an office, but by the 1800s, this building is being used as a quarter for enslaved people and a kitchen to do the cooking and serving, we believe, for Nellie Madison and for her sort of wing of the main house. So this ring was actually recovered from that kitchen quarter context, that later, that early 19th century context, rather than that earlier context. But why we think it came from Africa comes from a couple of things. One is the material itself, being carnelian, is incredibly rare. It is very rarely found in North America or in the Caribbean. So rare that it is the only time I have ever seen it archaeologically, and I have now officially been doing archaeology for 20 years. And rare enough that our fearless leader, Matt, had only seen it one time before. We venture to say 30 years ago, when he was doing work in Jamaica. When it is found archaeologically, it is almost exclusively found with people of African descent. Usually when it is found archaeologically, it is a bead rather than a ring. So finding a ring is incredibly rare. And usually it is found in burials. So something that is not necessarily monetarily incredibly valuable, but something that is incredibly valuable to people that had it. Carnelian is, when we found the ring and were first able to kind of make that preliminary identification, which was Matt running around going, oh my gosh, it's carnelian. And us going, what does that mean? We were then able to send it out to carnelian experts to use laser abrasion technology to do hardness testing on it to verify not only that it was carnelian, but what part of the world it came from. And it came from a very specific region in India. And from that region, the material was traded very heavily into the continent of Africa while not being traded into the Western Hemisphere. So the location of finding it in a place where enslaved African and African Americans would have lived and worked, the association of the material being heavily traded into Africa, but not into the New World. And then comparative archaeology, looking at a contemporaneous kitchen quarter building from Manassas battlefield, which is about 45 minutes away from here, where a ring was found in a similar context, but that ring was made of ebony, so an African source material found in a kitchen quarter context. We felt really comfortable starting to make the argument that this ring was connected to someone who had been taken from Africa, that it was on their body or on their person when they had been captured and brought into the New World, and then either passed down through the family, most likely, and then lost. And then my understanding of how this happened, and now we have both Matt and Betty on here, so you two can correct or corroborate. Matt was speaking to Betty, who is a member of our board here at Montpelier and also a member of the Montpelier Descendant Committee and a descendant here. And he started sharing with her the story of the ring. And Betty was able to share with us from her family's oral histories of how closely this basically scientific narrative we had created about the ring was to a story of a bead in her family that had been brought from Africa by her ancestor Mandy when she was captured, and then passed down through the family through her ancestor Corrine, who were enslaved cooks here at Montpelier. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's an awesome summary. Let's see if Betty has any corrections.
Betty, do you have any corrections? I'll take that as a no. Awesome.
That's a no, no corrections.
Thanks,
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right.
It's an important story, so thank you.
It is an incredibly important story, and it's very funny because as a curator of archaeological collections, I'm so like, everybody can touch everything. It's great, you know, like we're all here. I'm not as precious about things. I'm incredibly precious about this. I'm always like, where is it? How do we make sure it's secure? How do we make sure it's taken care of? And we're really excited that it is going to be, it's been on exhibit in the lab, but it's going to be on exhibit in the visitor center in our girls gallery pretty soon. So more people are going to be able to see it, which is really exciting. I'm going to hit some of the questions with their hands up, and I'll be bouncing between that and the chat. So Katya, is that how you say your name? You have your hand up.
Yes, my name is Katya. Hello, thank you. I worked on a property in Key West, Florida. It's a mid-19th century property. And as I listened to your talk, I was just thinking, I was wondering what you thought about it. As we move collectively you know, as a society to equity and looking at everyone equally. Do you think that historic sites are going to have to re-examine their collections and their artifacts to look at them in a new way in order to survive? And I just was wondering what you were thinking about that.
Oh my gosh, I love this question. I also love that you work on a site in Florida as a native Floridian, so it double makes me happy. I feel incredibly strongly that we're going to have to be looking at our collections differently in order to survive. One is, what's the point of keeping them if we're not re-examining them and asking new questions? If everything we already know or could know about something, you know, there's really no point in doing all of the stewardship, all of the storage. And I think every generation of archaeologists, of historians, of museum professional has a new set of questions because they're drawing on whether it's their own personal experiences or new bodies of knowledge, new theories, reading new things. So I think it's absolutely essential for organizations in a very crass way to justify maintaining collections, but in a very real way of telling the kinds of stories that people want to hear. And I think one of the things a lot of historic sites have run into is you'll hear people say, oh, you know, those millennials, they don't want to come to historic sites. And I can say this as the oldest millennial. But it's what they're finding out is they do, millennials, Gen Z, they do want to come to historic sites, but they don't want to hear the same old stories that have been told for generations. They want to hear stories that are about a greater diversity of people, of experiences, and allow them to connect to a more, I'm going to say like a more complete understanding of the past that is comfortable living in these gray areas and comfortable with nuance, and everything isn't just, you know, black and white, right and wrong. So, and that encourages them to think differently. So I think it's really exciting. And one of the things I love is when we have students that want to re-examine our collections and have new questions for them, because some of our greatest discoveries have happened through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a lot of resistance. It was a sea captain's house, and we were doing archaeology, and then we decided to try and put back a slave quarter and cookhouse. And there was a lot of local pushback and a lot of nervousness on the part of the board about just what you were saying, you know, people don't want to see the ugly and people aren't going to come here and that kind of thing. So I think going forward, a lot of these white-owned historic homes really have to dig deep and find the bravery to deal with the enslavement history, whether if they want to continue, and looking at an artifact and not just saying, well, you know, because like you said, like bringing your judgment to the piece, but re-examining everything from a modern sensibility. But so I think it's an exciting time, a definitely exciting time for history.
One of the things that I think I'm most excited about here is in that re-examination process of doing it in collaboration with the Montpelier Descendant Committee, doing it with the descendants, of saying, what are the questions that you have? Just like this story of the ring, Betty's family's oral history allowed us to really kind of bring it all together. And, you know, the questions that I have as someone trained in archaeology are going to be very different from the questions that somebody has when they're saying, well, this is where my great-grandmother lived. This is where my great-grandfather lived. And I think it's that really meaningful collaboration of making important decisions on what gets displayed, what gets preserved, what stories get told, what resources do we use. Having over 3 million artifacts in the archaeological collection means less than 0.001% of my collection is currently on display. Wow. So as the gatekeeper of that is way too much power for me to have. And being able to spread that power with members of the descendant community and work in partnership, I think is going to be the biggest shift and the most positive shift we can do. Dean, I want to go to you because you had your hand up too.
Thank you, Mary, for this beautiful presentation. This is great, great organization and presentation. I have a question. I was just wondering if there's any evidence for enslaved women at Montpelier having any community leadership kinds of roles. You mentioned possibly education, with the slate pencil connection, but other kinds of, what kind of community leadership roles might they have had, either as organizers of their community, or it could be religious leaders to some extent, could be some kind of healthcare provider role, or something, some indication where a particular enslaved woman, or perhaps a group of them, might have taken on some kind of leadership role in their community at Montpelier or locally.
That's a great question. What I immediately think of is an archaeologist by the name of Whitney Battle Baptiste wrote a book called Black Feminist Archaeology. And in that book, she re-examined the archaeological collections from the Hermitage, which is Andrew Jackson's plantation house in Tennessee. And what she found was really the distribution of households and organizations of households with enslaved women as being kind of serving as the head of household was represented in the archaeological record. And I think a lot of what we see is that representation of enslaved women in particular serving as the head of the household, as that kind of leadership role. And a lot of that has to do with the rules of slavery, the laws of slavery, in which the status of someone, whether they are enslaved or not, comes from their mother, not from their father. So sometimes the enslaved person's father could be their enslaver. Sometimes the enslaved person's father maybe lives on a different plantation, because we often know of marriages that went across plantations or across properties. For example, Paul Jennings, who was enslaved at Montpelier, his wife was enslaved on a different plantation. So really seeing women as these heads of household, kind of organizing households in a more matrilineal, if you will, kind of organization, where it's often women and their siblings and their children organizing, rather than kind of that nuclear family model. So I think that is a way we would definitely see it here. The other things that I can sort of think of off the top of my head for kind of in the community, I think is a little harder for me to think of for this time period, but definitely in the organization of heads of household. And I think that is a really important leadership role that's happening here. I'm going to bounce to the chat, and then I'm going to go to you, Lou. So Katie asked, how could looking at gender and highlighting women's stories in the archaeological record change how we understand not just the enslaved community and history of Montpelier, but American history more generally? Well, I think, yeah, if we can understand Montpelier differently, we can understand everything a little differently. And I think it becomes really important when we look at these stories of the past, or what our understanding of the past is, to always ask ourselves, who's not being talked about? When we learn about a particular time period or a particular event in American history, if you go, who's being mentioned and who's not being mentioned? And for that who's not being mentioned, well, where are they at this moment? What are they doing? And when you start to ask those questions, all of a sudden, those people that are often have been left out of, whether it's what we're taught history in school or what's presented to us in movies, it allows you to start to explore. And so often what we'll find is often women are not mentioned, often children are not mentioned, often people of color are not mentioned, often queer people are not mentioned or identified as such. And so when you start asking yourself those questions about who's not being talked about, then that opens the door. And I think what becomes really important for that, it allows us, to understand the past in a more complete way. It allows us to situate ourselves in the present as, kind of not realizing that women didn't just get the right to vote and all of a sudden like appear, which is kind of how often we're taught in history, is like women aren't part of American history until Seneca falls, and then all of a sudden they're there and are part of American history. So I think asking ourselves those questions can really open a lot of doors. Lou, I'm going to go to you if you're ready.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just saw that image by, I think it was Latrobe, very briefly, but I thought that was very interesting. And I think there's a lot of unpacking one could do from just that one image. I mean, you've got the white guy, very nattily dressed, standing on a stump, looking down, surveilling the two workers. So the span of control is one person to two. That was pretty amazing. He's obviously not dressed to do any work. They're doing the work. There's all these stumps there. And that really surprised me, that they would not have removed the stumps. But of course, removing stumps is very labor intensive. And, now these days we'd use dynamite or a tractor or something. So there's just all kinds of things that you can learn and questions you can ask from that one brief image. And I just wondered if anybody has ever gone through as many images as they could find like that and assembled them somewhere and come up with more questions and perhaps more answers. Thanks.
Great question. I think that definitely, so that image itself is not of Montpelier, but I think we do have images from the period of enslavement of Montpelier, drawings, sketches. One of the ones that we've looked at quite a few times shows the temple. And if you look really close in it, there's a drawing of an enslaved woman walking along basically the fence kind of towards the temple. And so we have done a lot of analysis, particularly of the images of Montpelier that come out of particularly the 1800s. And there are a lot of archaeologists that work really closely with art historians to kind of say, okay, what is in this image and how do we see this reflected in the material culture? And I think you're exactly right. It opens up a whole bunch of questions because what do they say? A picture captures 1,000 words. So how this exact scene maybe would or would not show up in the documentary record is quite a bit different than how it's depicted in this image. And then, of course, how we then see it in the archaeological record. So let's see. Oh gosh, there's questions in the chat. Tessa, there's great conversations in the chat if you haven't. So Tessa, who is our architectural historian, technician, she writes, and Tessa also helped us identify that it was a tobacco barn. So Tessa gets all the credit in the world for that. From her understanding of tobacco cultivation in the 20th century, stringing tobacco to be hung in barns secure was a lot of times delegated to women. And she would guess that enslaved women could have also done this type of work in tobacco barns. And I think you're exactly right. A lot of this process, a lot of this work is going to be done by enslaved women. Let's see. Are there any questions I'm missing? I don't know. Did anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I had her hand raised a little while ago.
Mary,
Carolyn, did you have? Oh, I'm sorry.
I just put in the chat a link to a compilation of images by Jerome Handler, who works for the Virginia Humanities, and he's spent like the past 10 years assembling these, and he's got them in a map, an interactive map, which is pretty cool. And actually has the image you showed of Latrobe's. So and great talk, by the way, Mary. This is awesome. Thanks for doing this.
Well, thank you guys so much for kind of going on this ride with me. It was, sometimes the best talks leave you with more questions than answers, right? So I think I'm really excited about the future research we could do, the kinds of things we can look at, the kinds of questions we could ask. And if you're interested in this stuff, I invite you all, I know many of you have been, but please come on one of our programs this year. we are going to be excavating in the home farm again, both at what we think is a domestic site, but also at a site that's possibly a barn or another labor site. So really kind of trying to pull these this information all together. So yes, Matt put the website in the chat. So please reach out to us if you have any questions about anything I talked about, or if you're interested in any of this. You can always reach out to me via email. I'll put my email in the chat, and Matt will be putting this recording up on YouTube and on our Digital Doorway webpage. So you can watch me talk all over again if you want. All right, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Mary. It was
Thank you,
wonderful.
Mary.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Mary.
Matt.
Great presentation.
Nice seeing everybody.
Thanks, Mary.
Great job, Mary.